In the ancient city of Florence, where marble statues cast long shadows across cobblestone streets and the scent of fresh parchment mingled with the aroma of wine cellars, there lived a man whose understanding of power would echo through centuries. Niccolo Machiavelli had witnessed empires rise and fall, had seen princes crowned and dethroned, yet it was not the grand spectacles of war or revolution that concerned him most deeply. It was the quiet erosion, the gradual decay that gnawed at the foundations of states, while their rulers remained blissfully unaware. The morning sun filtered through the narrow windows of Machiavelli's study as he dipped his quill into ink. Before him lay scattered reports from across the Italian peninsula, tales of city-states that had seemed invincible mere decades ago, now reduced to rubble and memory. What struck him was not the violence of their destruction, but its subtlety. These kingdoms had not fallen to mighty armies or divine intervention. They had crumbled from within, victims of dangers they had failed to perceive until it was far too late. The essence of unnoticed peril, Machiavelli understood, lay in its very invisibility. Like a slow poison coursing through the veins of a robust man, political decay often masked itself as stability, even prosperity. The most dangerous threats to a state were not the obvious ones, the foreign armies massing at the borders or the rebellious nobles plotting in castle halls, but rather the gradual shifts that occurred so slowly they seemed natural, inevitable, even beneficial. Consider the Republic of Venice, that magnificent maritime empire that had commanded the Mediterranean for centuries. Its merchants had grown wealthy beyond measure. Its fleets had dominated trade routes from Constantinople to London, and its political system had achieved a delicate balance between aristocratic privilege and commercial necessity. Yet beneath this glittering surface, the seeds of decline had been sown generations earlier. The very success that made Venice great had created the conditions for its eventual weakness. The Venetian nobility, grown fat on trade profits, had gradually withdrawn from the dirty business of commerce, preferring instead to live as landed gentlemen on the terra firma. They leased their trading rights to foreign merchants, collected rents from properties acquired with maritime wealth, and concerned themselves more with genealogy than geography. This transformation seemed natural. Even admirable, successful merchants becoming cultured aristocrats was surely the mark of a civilized society. Meanwhile, the actual work of trade passed increasingly into foreign hands. German merchants established themselves in the Fondaco dei Tedeschi. Portuguese navigators opened new routes around Africa that bypassed Venetian middlemen entirely, and Dutch financiers created new forms of credit that made traditional Venetian banking seem antiquated. Each of these developments appeared insignificant when viewed in isolation. Venice remained wealthy, its palaces grew ever more magnificent, and its citizens enjoyed a standard of living that was the envy of Europe. Yet Machiavelli recognized that Venice was slowly strangling itself with silk threads. The Republic's strength had always derived from the marriage of political power and commercial acumen. When these began to separate, when the ruling class lost its intimate connection with the sources of Venetian wealth, the state became vulnerable in ways that were not immediately apparent. The danger was not that Venice would collapse overnight, but that it would gradually lose the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances, to respond to new challenges, or to regenerate itself when faced with adversity. This pattern of unnoticed decline was not unique to Venice. Across Italy, Machiavelli observed similar processes at work. In Milan, the Sforza dukes had created a magnificently efficient administrative state, with elaborate bureaucracies that could manage everything from tax collection to military recruitment with unprecedented precision. The system worked so well that it seemed to run itself, requiring little direct involvement from the ruler or active participation from the citizenry. This efficiency was celebrated as the highest achievement of statecraft, proof that human society could be organized according to rational principles. But Machiavelli saw danger in this very perfection. A state that ran too smoothly, that required too little from its citizens, risked creating a population that was politically passive and mentally soft. When crisis came, as it inevitably would, Such a people would lack the strength and will necessary for resistance. They would have grown accustomed to being governed rather than governing themselves, to being protected rather than fighting for their protection. The administrative excellence that made Milan strong in peaceful times would become a source of weakness when strength was needed most. The duchy's fall came not through any dramatic failure of its bureaucratic machinery, but through the simple fact that when French armies crossed the Alps, there was no one left with the courage and skill to resist them. The administrators could process surrender documents with remarkable efficiency, but they could not inspire the kind of desperate valor that had once made Italian city-states unconquerable. The peril had been there all along, hidden within the very success of the system. In Rome, the pattern took yet another form. The papal court had achieved unprecedented wealth and influence, attracting artists, scholars, and diplomats from across Europe. The city had become a glittering center of Renaissance culture, where ancient learning was rediscovered and new forms of artistic expression flourished. The popes commanded respect from kings and emperors, their approval could legitimize dynasties, and their displeasure could topple governments. Yet this very success contained the seeds of spiritual and political decline. The Church had become so focused on temporal power, so invested in worldly magnificence, that it had lost touch with the spiritual needs that gave it legitimacy. The more the papacy resembled a secular kingdom, the more it became vulnerable to the same forces that destroyed secular kingdoms. The corruption was not dramatic or sudden. It was the gradual accumulation of small compromises, each seemingly reasonable in its immediate context, but collectively devastating in their long-term impact. Machiavelli understood that the most insidious aspect of such corruption was its gradual normalization. What shocked one generation became routine for the next. Standards of behavior that would have scandalized earlier ages came to seem natural and inevitable. The Church's moral authority eroded not through any single catastrophic event, but through the slow process of accommodation to worldly temptations. By the time the damage became apparent, it was already too late to reverse course without fundamental transformation. The prince who wished to avoid such fate needed to develop what Machiavelli termed the eye of suspicion, the ability to perceive danger in apparent prosperity, to identify weakness in seeming strength, and to recognize the enemy in the guise of a friend. This required a fundamental shift in perspective, a willingness to question success itself, and to remain perpetually vigilant against the very forces that brought advancement and comfort. Traditional wisdom taught that good government created stability, that successful policy should be continued indefinitely, and that change should be avoided unless absolutely necessary. But Machiavelli recognized that this wisdom, while containing important truths, could become a trap for the unwary ruler. Stability could become stagnation, successful policies could outlive their usefulness, and resistance to change could prevent necessary adaptation. The skilled prince needed to cultivate a paradoxical mindset, grateful for success but suspicious of it, enjoying stability while preparing for instability, trusting in proven methods while remaining open to innovation. This was not the nervous anxiety of the insecure ruler who saw enemies everywhere, but rather the calm vigilance of the experienced physician who understood that health itself could mask the onset of disease. In his private correspondence with Francesco Vettori, Machiavelli explored this theme further, drawing analogies between political health and physical health. Just as a skilled doctor knew that certain symptoms of apparent wellness, excessive appetite, unusual energy, heightened color in the cheeks, could actually indicate the onset of serious illness, so too must the political physician learn to read the subtle signs that success was breeding its own destruction. The most dangerous moment in the life of any state, Machiavelli concluded, was not during obvious crises when everyone's attention was focused on survival, but during periods of apparent prosperity when vigilance naturally relaxed. It was precisely when things seemed to be going well that the most serious threats could take root and grow undetected. The enemy that arrived unnoticed was infinitely more dangerous than the one who announced his presence with trumpets and banners. This insight led Machiavelli to develop what he privately called the doctrine of beneficial disturbance. A wise prince should periodically introduce controlled disruptions into his state, not enough to cause genuine crisis, but sufficient to prevent the kind of complacency that made societies vulnerable to real threats. Like a physician who prescribed mild exercise to prevent more serious ailments, the political doctor should ensure his patient never became so comfortable as to lose the capacity for vigorous response. The Florentine Republic had provided Machiavelli with numerous examples of this principle in action. During periods when the city faced external threats or internal conflicts, its citizens displayed remarkable energy, creativity, and solidarity. Merchants became soldiers, artists turned engineers, and scholars transformed into diplomats. The very difficulties that seemed to threaten Florence's existence actually strengthened its capacity for survival and growth. But during peacetime, when trade flowed smoothly and external threats seemed distant, the same population that had shown such resilience gradually grew soft and fractious. Citizens became more concerned with personal comfort than public welfare, more interested in private gain than collective security. The institutions that had served Florence well during times of struggle proved inadequate for managing the challenges of success and prosperity. The paradox was that Florence was simultaneously at its strongest and its weakest during periods of apparent calm. Strong because its accumulated wealth and well-developed institutions gave it tremendous resources and capabilities. Weak because its citizens lacked the sense of urgency and common purpose that made those resources effective. The city was like a powerful army encamped in comfortable quarters, well supplied and well equipped but growing daily less capable of actual combat. Machiavelli's analysis extended beyond individual cities to encompass the broader patterns of Italian politics. The peninsula's fragmentation into numerous competing states had created a laboratory for political experimentation, allowing different approaches to governance to develop and be tested against one another. Yet this same fragmentation had made Italy vulnerable to foreign intervention, as outside powers could play Italian states against each other or find local allies to support their own ambitions. The French invasion of 1494 had revealed just how hollow Italian strength had become. States that had seemed powerful and sophisticated proved incapable of effective resistance to foreign armies that were often smaller but more unified and purposeful. The very refinement of Italian political culture, the elaborate diplomacy and careful balance of power that had characterized peninsula politics for generations, had created a system that was too complex and too fragile to withstand the shock of external assault. Here again the peril had arrived unnoticed. The gradual sophistication of Italian politics had seemed like progress, evidence that civilization was advancing beyond the crude warfare of earlier eras. The replacement of military conquest with diplomatic maneuvering appeared to represent the triumph of intelligence over brute force. Yet this apparent advance had actually made Italian states less capable of defending themselves when diplomatic solutions proved inadequate. The lesson was clear: in politics, as in war, the most dangerous enemy was often the one that appeared to be a friend, or even better, the one that seemed to be oneself. The greatest threats to political survival came not from obvious antagonists, but from the very forces and processes that brought success and advancement. Understanding this principle was essential for any ruler who wished to avoid the fate that had befallen so many seemingly powerful states. Part 2. The mechanisms of unperceived destruction. The second aspect of political peril that Machiavelli examined with particular intensity involved the mechanisms by which destruction operated beneath the surface of apparent stability. Unlike the dramatic collapses chronicled by historians, the sack of cities, the overthrow of dynasties, the conquest of kingdoms, the most devastating forms of political decay worked through subtle processes that were almost impossible to detect until they had progressed beyond the point of remedy. In his careful study of the Roman Republic, Machiavelli identified what he termed the corruption of victory as one of the most insidious of these mechanisms. Rome's triumph over Carthage in the Punic Wars had established it as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, bringing unprecedented wealth and territory under Roman control. Yet this very success had set in motion processes that would eventually destroy the republic that had achieved it. The problem was not that victory brought obvious dangers, foreign enemies, or internal rebellion, but that it changed the fundamental character of Roman society in ways that were gradual, seemingly beneficial, and almost impossible to reverse. The citizen soldiers who had defeated Hannibal returned home to find that their small farms had been neglected or destroyed during years of military service. Rather than restore these properties, many veterans sold their land to wealthy speculators who consolidated holdings into vast estates worked by slave labor captured in Rome's conquests. This transformation seemed economically rational and even progressive. Large-scale agriculture was more efficient than subsistence farming. Slave labor was abundant and cheap thanks to military success, and the displaced farmers could find employment in Rome's growing urban economy. Former soldiers became craftsmen, merchants, or clients of powerful patrons, enjoying higher living standards than they could have achieved as small farmers. The city of Rome grew magnificent, its population swelled with immigrants from across the Mediterranean, and its markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world. Yet Machiavelli recognized that this apparent improvement had fatally weakened the foundation of Roman strength. The citizen farmer had been both the source of Roman military power and the embodiment of Roman virtue. These men fought fiercely because they were defending their own property and their own way of life. They accepted the hardships of military service because they understood that their personal welfare depended on Rome's success. They returned from campaigns to productive work that connected them to the land and to traditional values that emphasized duty, frugality, and self-reliance. When this class disappeared, replaced by urban masses dependent on grain distributions and entertainment provided by the state, the character of Roman politics fundamentally changed. Elections became contests to see who could promise the most generous benefits to the people. Military service became a career choice rather than a civic duty, and political leaders competed to demonstrate their magnificence rather than their virtue. Each of these changes seemed reasonable in its immediate context, but collectively, they created a system that was unsustainable. The urban population that had replaced the citizen farmers was simultaneously more powerful and less reliable than its predecessor. Concentrated in the city, this mass could make its political demands heard immediately and dramatically. Politicians ignored urban opinion at their peril, as riots could destroy careers overnight. Yet this same population had no deep stake in Rome's long-term welfare. They supported whoever offered them the best immediate benefits, regardless of the long-term consequences of such policies. The military, meanwhile, had become professionalized in ways that made it both more effective and more dangerous. Professional legions could conquer territories that citizen militias could never have subdued, but these same legions owed their loyalty to the commanders who paid them, rather than to the state that commissioned them. The very success of Roman arms had created the instruments of the Republic's destruction. Machiavelli observed that this patterned success creating the conditions for its own destruction was not unique to Rome, but represented a fundamental tendency in all political systems. The qualities that made a state strong and prosperous inevitably changed the circumstances that had originally made those qualities effective. What began as adaptive responses to particular challenges gradually became rigid institutions that were poorly suited to new conditions. In his analysis of contemporary Florence, Machiavelli identified similar processes at work. The city's commercial success had been built on the enterprise and innovation of its merchants, who had developed new forms of banking, manufacturing, and trade that made Florence wealthy beyond its size and natural resources. Yet this same success had created a merchant aristocracy that was increasingly disconnected from the commercial activities that had made them rich. The sons and grandsons of successful merchants preferred to live as gentlemen rather than traders, investing their inherited wealth in land, art, and political influence rather than productive commercial ventures. This seemed like natural social evolution, successful families rising in status and sophistication. But Machiavelli recognized that it represented a fundamental threat to Florence's continued prosperity. The new generation of Florentine aristocrats retained the political influence that came with wealth but lacked the commercial expertise that had created that wealth in the first place. They made political decisions based on abstract principles or personal preferences rather than practical understanding of economic realities. They were more concerned with maintaining their status and dignity than with adapting to changing market conditions or technological innovations. Meanwhile, the actual work of commerce increasingly passed to foreign merchants who lacked political influence in Florence, but possessed the skills and connections necessary for success in changing markets. These foreigners had no loyalty to Florence beyond their immediate business interests, and they could easily relocate their operations if conditions became unfavorable. The city was becoming dependent on people who had no reason to share its long-term interests. This process was virtually impossible to detect while it was happening because each individual decision seemed rational and beneficial. When a merchant's son chose to study classical literature rather than accounting, he was pursuing a worthy and admirable goal. When a wealthy family invested in beautiful palaces and artwork rather than risky commercial ventures, they were making conservative financial decisions while contributing to cultural development. When foreign merchants were welcomed to Florence, they brought capital, skills, and connections that benefited everyone involved. Yet the cumulative effect of these individually reasonable decisions was to gradually undermine the foundation of Florentine strength. The city was becoming beautiful, cultured, and sophisticated while simultaneously becoming vulnerable and dependent. Its citizens were becoming more refined and educated while becoming less capable of defending their independence and prosperity. Machiavelli termed this phenomenon the gilding of decay, the tendency for political and social decline to disguise itself as cultural and economic advancement. The most dangerous forms of corruption were not crude or obvious, but subtle and attractive. They appealed to humanity's highest aspirations for beauty, knowledge, refinement, and security, while secretly undermining the foundations that made those aspirations achievable. The mechanism worked through what Machiavelli called the substitution of effects for causes. People naturally focused on the immediate benefits of prosperity, comfortable living conditions, cultural opportunities, security from violence, and lost sight of the underlying conditions that made such benefits possible. They began to treat these effects as if they were causes, assuming that as long as they maintained comfortable and cultured lives, their prosperity would be secure. States invested heavily in projects that demonstrated their wealth and sophistication, magnificent buildings, elaborate ceremonies, generous welfare systems, while neglecting the military forces, economic institutions, and social structures that actually generated wealth and power. Citizens demanded that their governments provide them with the comfortable lifestyles they had come to expect, without understanding or caring about how such provision might affect the state's long-term capacity to meet those demands. The process was particularly insidious because it created positive feedback loops that accelerated decay while making it seem like progress. As military virtues declined, investment in defensive fortifications increased, making citizens feel more secure while actually making them less capable of active defense. As commercial skills atrophied, consumption of luxury goods rose, creating the impression of continued prosperity while the capacity for wealth creation diminished. As political participation decreased, government services expanded, satisfying immediate needs while reducing civic competence. Machiavelli's study of papal politics provided another illustration of these mechanisms at work. The Church's accumulation of temporal power and wealth had been motivated by genuinely religious concerns, the desire to protect spiritual freedom from secular interference, to provide material support for religious activities, and to create impressive settings for divine worship. Each step in the Church's political development had been justified by legitimate spiritual goals. Yet the pursuit of these goals had gradually transformed the Church into something that was primarily political rather than spiritual. Popes spent more time managing territories and conducting diplomacy than providing religious leadership. Cardinals accumulated benefices and revenues that enabled magnificent lifestyles but also created powerful incentives to treat ecclesiastical office as a career opportunity rather than a spiritual calling. The Church's wealth attracted people who were motivated by ambition and greed rather than faith and service. The transformation was so gradual and so well-intentioned that it was almost impossible to recognize as corruption. At each stage, church leaders could point to genuine religious benefits that justified their political activities. The papal court's magnificence did inspire awe and reverence. Church territories did provide resources for charitable works and artistic patronage. Ecclesiastical diplomacy did protect Christian communities from hostile powers. The immediate effects of church wealth and power were often genuinely beneficial, but the long-term consequences were devastating for the church's spiritual authority and moral influence. As the papacy came to resemble a secular kingdom, it became vulnerable to the same forces that destroyed secular kingdoms. Worse, its spiritual pretensions made its worldly behavior seem hypocritical and scandalous in ways that purely secular corruption would not. The very success of the church's political project undermined its religious mission. Machiavelli recognized that this pattern extended far beyond specific institutions, to encompass entire civilizations. The process he had observed in individual cities and states was also at work on a larger scale. The same forces that made particular communities wealthy, sophisticated, and powerful were simultaneously making them vulnerable to simpler, more primitive societies that retained qualities that civilization had gradually abandoned. The barbarian invasions that had destroyed the Roman Empire provided the historical template for understanding this larger pattern. The Germanic tribes that overran Rome were not more civilized or sophisticated than the Romans they conquered. Indeed, by almost every measure that Romans valued, literary culture, architectural achievement, legal sophistication, military organization, the barbarians were clearly inferior, yet they possessed qualities that civilized society had gradually lost: personal courage, group loyalty, adaptation to harsh conditions, and willingness to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term advantage. Roman civilization had not been conquered by superior civilization, but by superior barbarism. The very refinements that made Roman society admirable had also made it incapable of defending itself against enemies who were willing to accept higher risks and greater hardships in pursuit of their goals. The Romans had become too civilized for their own good, too sophisticated to maintain the primitive virtues that had originally made civilization possible. Machiavelli saw this same dynamic at work in his own time. European society was reaching levels of sophistication and refinement that rivaled ancient Rome, but it was also developing the same vulnerabilities that had made Rome susceptible to barbarian conquest. The question was whether modern states could learn from Rome's example and find ways to maintain civilized values without losing the capacity for vigorous self-defense. The challenge was particularly acute because the mechanisms of decay were so difficult to detect and resist. Unlike external enemies or natural disasters, internal corruption worked through processes that seemed beneficial and were often genuinely beneficial in the short term. Resisting such processes required a kind of political asceticism, the willingness to sacrifice immediate advantages for long-term security, to maintain difficult disciplines even when they seemed unnecessary, and to preserve institutions and practices whose value was not immediately apparent. This was perhaps the most difficult challenge facing any statesman: how to convince people to resist temptations that were genuinely tempting, to maintain vigilance against dangers that were genuinely subtle, and to preserve capacities that they might never need to use. The answer required understanding not just the mechanisms of political decay, but also the psychology of political resistance. Part 3. The art of recognizing and confronting hidden perils. The final and most crucial aspect of Machiavelli's analysis concerned the practical methods by which a prudent ruler might identify and address the subtle dangers that threatened political survival. This was not merely a matter of theoretical understanding, but of developing specific techniques and habits of mind that could function effectively in the complex environment of actual governance. The prince who understood the nature of hidden perils but lacked the tools to combat them would be like a physician who could diagnose a disease but possess no cure. Machiavelli's first principle was that effective political surveillance required looking beyond immediate appearances to examine underlying patterns and trends. Just as a skilled hunter learned to read tracks, broken branches, and other subtle signs that revealed the presence and movement of prey, so the political hunter needed to develop sensitivity to indicators that most people overlooked entirely. This required cultivating what he termed the historical eye, the ability to see present events in the context of larger patterns that had played out over generations or centuries. The development of such vision demanded extensive study of historical precedents, not for the purpose of finding exact parallels to contemporary situations, but to understand the general principles by which political change, every state that had fallen, had displayed certain characteristic symptoms before its collapse symptoms that were visible to those who knew how to look, but were ignored by those who focused only on immediate circumstances. In his private notebooks, Machiavelli cataloged these warning signs with the systematic precision of a natural philosopher. Economic symptoms included the gradual shift from productive to consumptive activities, the increasing dependence on foreign suppliers for essential goods, and the concentration of wealth in fewer hands while overall prosperity appeared to increase. Social symptoms encompassed the loss of military virtues among the general population, the preference for comfort over achievement among the elite, and the substitution of entertainment for meaningful civic participation. Political symptoms were perhaps the most important but also the most difficult to detect accurately. They included the gradual transfer of real authority from formal institutions to informal networks, the increasing use of emergency powers for routine administration, and the growing gap between official rhetoric and actual policy. Most significantly, they involved what Machiavelli called the domestication of opposition, the process by which potential sources of resistance to government policy were gradually absorbed into the governmental system itself. This last phenomenon was particularly insidious because it created the appearance of political health while actually destroying the mechanisms that kept government accountable and responsive. When opposition leaders were co-opted through offers of office or other benefits, when independent institutions became dependent on government funding, and when civic organizations transformed themselves into advocacy groups seeking particular benefits rather than maintaining general principles, the result was not improved governance, but the elimination of effective restraints on governmental power. The challenge for the observant prince was that these changes typically occurred so gradually that each individual step seemed insignificant. The appointment of a few opposition leaders to government positions could be presented as admirable bipartisanship. The provision of government funding to previously independent organizations could be justified as necessary support for important social functions. The expansion of emergency powers could be defended as essential responses to genuine crises. Yet the cumulative effect of such measures was to create a political system that was simultaneously more centralized and less stable than its predecessor. Centralized because real authority became concentrated in fewer hands, regardless of formal institutional arrangements. Less stable because the elimination of legitimate opposition created conditions in which resistance, when it finally emerged, would necessarily take illegitimate and potentially violent forms. Machiavelli's analysis of these patterns led him to develop what he privately termed the method of inverse thinking, a systematic approach to political analysis that involved asking not what policies would solve immediate problems, but what unintended consequences might flow from apparently successful solutions. This required the intellectual discipline to resist the natural human tendency to focus on intended effects and to consider instead the broader systemic changes that any significant policy would inevitably produce. The method worked by examining each proposed course of action from multiple perspectives and timeframes. A policy that appeared beneficial when viewed from the perspective of immediate stakeholders might prove harmful when considered from the standpoint of future generations. A solution that seemed effective when judged by its impact on specific problems might create larger difficulties when its broader systemic effects were taken into account. For example, the decision to supplement citizen militias with professional soldiers appeared obviously beneficial from the perspective of military effectiveness. Professional troops were better trained, more reliable, and more capable of complex operations than part-time citizen soldiers could ever be. From the standpoint of military commanders and political leaders who needed to achieve specific objectives quickly and efficiently, professionalization seemed like obvious progress. But when viewed through the lens of inverse thinking, the long-term consequences appeared much more problematic. Professional armies were expensive, requiring higher taxes that might burden the economy and create popular resentment. They were politically dangerous, owing loyalty to whoever paid them rather than to the state or its citizens. Most importantly, they relieved ordinary citizens of military responsibilities, gradually eroding the martial virtues and civic commitment that had originally made the state strong enough to afford professional soldiers. The immediate problem, military ineffectiveness, would indeed be solved, but at the cost of creating new and potentially more serious problems. The state would become militarily stronger but politically weaker, better able to fight foreign enemies but more vulnerable to internal subversion. The cure might prove worse than the disease, not because it failed to achieve its intended purpose, but because it succeeded too well while producing unintended side effects. Applying this method of analysis required developing extensive networks of information sources that could provide perspectives unavailable to official channels. Machiavelli cultivated relationships with merchants, artisans, clerics, soldiers, and scholars, people whose daily activities gave them insight into aspects of social and economic life that rarely appeared in official reports. He paid particular attention to the concerns and complaints of groups whose interests were not directly represented in formal political processes, but whose cooperation was essential for effective governance. These informal intelligence networks served multiple functions beyond simple information gathering. They provided early warning of developing problems before they reached the level of formal political attention. They offered alternative interpretations of events that challenged official assumptions and revealed hidden connections between apparently unrelated developments. Most importantly, they helped identify potential sources of future resistance or support that might not be apparent through conventional political analysis. The maintenance of such networks required considerable skill and discretion. Informants needed to trust that their communications would remain confidential and would not be used against their immediate interests. They also needed to believe that their insights would be taken seriously and might actually influence policy decisions. This meant that the prince who sought reliable intelligence had to be willing to act on information that contradicted his preferences or challenged his assumptions. Machiavelli recognized that the greatest obstacle to effective political intelligence was often the ruler's own psychology. People in positions of power naturally preferred information that confirmed their existing beliefs and validated their previous decisions. They surrounded themselves with advisors who told them what they wanted to hear and avoided sources of information that might force them to acknowledge uncomfortable realities. This tendency was particularly dangerous when dealing with subtle, long-term threats that required sustained attention and might demand unpopular countermeasures. The ruler who wished to address such threats effectively needed to cultivate intellectual humility and emotional detachment, the willingness to consider that his most cherished policies might be mistaken and that his most trusted advisors might be telling him lies. The development of such mental discipline required regular exposure to alternative perspectives and systematic questioning of official assumptions. Machiavelli recommended that rulers establish formal procedures for soliciting dissenting opinions, create institutional mechanisms for reviewing and revising successful policies, and maintain personal relationships with individuals who were known for their independence and critical thinking rather than their loyalty and agreement. Beyond gathering and analyzing information, the prince needed practical methods for addressing the problems that such analysis revealed. This was often more difficult than identifying the problems themselves, because effective countermeasures frequently required actions that appeared unnecessary or even harmful from the perspective of immediate circumstances. Convincing people to accept short-term costs in order to address long-term threats required exceptional political skill and moral authority. Machiavelli's approach to this challenge centered on what he called the principle of gradual adjustment, the idea that major systemic changes should be implemented through small, incremental steps rather than dramatic reforms. This method worked with human psychology rather than against it. allowing people to adapt gradually to new conditions rather than forcing them to accept sudden disruptions to familiar patterns. The principle operated on the recognition that most people could accept small changes that seemed reasonable in their immediate context, even when they might resist larger changes that achieved the same ultimate objective. A ruler who attempted to reform military service by immediately abolishing professional armies and returning to citizen militias would likely face insurmountable resistance from military officers, government officials, and citizens who had grown comfortable with existing arrangements. But the same objective might be achievable through a series of smaller steps, gradually increasing the role of citizen militias in local defense, requiring military service from broader segments of the population, reducing the size of professional forces through natural attrition rather than dismissals, and creating educational programs that emphasized civic virtue and military preparedness. Each individual step could be justified in terms of immediate benefits, cost savings, improved local security, broader civic participation, while contributing to the larger goal of restoring the connection between citizenship and military service. The success of such an approach depended heavily on timing and sequencing. Changes needed to be introduced when circumstances made them seem natural and necessary rather than arbitrary or ideological. They needed to be presented in terms of widely shared values rather than abstract theories. Most importantly, they needed to produce visible benefits quickly enough to build support for subsequent steps while avoiding negative consequences that might discredit the entire program. This required the ruler to think several moves ahead, like a skilled chess player who understood how current positions might develop into future advantages or disadvantages. Each policy decision needed to be evaluated not only for its immediate effects but for its impact on the range of future options available to the government. Some apparently beneficial policies might foreclose more valuable future possibilities, while some seemingly costly choices might create opportunities for greater future gains. The management of public opinion presented particular challenges in this context. The gradual nature of systemic threats meant that their effects often became apparent only after they had progressed beyond the point of easy remedy. By the time ordinary citizens recognized the danger, it might be too late to address it through conventional political processes. This created a dilemma for the responsible ruler. Should he act on his understanding of developing threats even if he could not easily explain the necessity for action to his subjects? Machiavelli's answer was that the truly skilled prince would find ways to educate his people about long-term threats without causing panic or despair. This required developing new forms of political communication that could convey complex ideas in accessible language, create emotional engagement with abstract concepts, and motivate sustained effort toward long-term goals. The prince needed to become not just a political leader, but a teacher and storyteller capable of helping his subjects understand their situation and their options. The most effective approach involved connecting immediate, visible problems to larger patterns that people could learn to recognize themselves. Rather than simply asserting that certain policies were necessary to address abstract future threats, the wise ruler would demonstrate how those same policies would solve current problems that people already understood and cared about. This created a foundation of practical experience that could support more complex understanding as circumstances developed. For example, military reforms could be introduced as responses to immediate security concerns or budget constraints rather than as preparations for hypothetical future conflicts. Economic policies could be framed in terms of current competitiveness rather than abstract theories about long-term social development. Teddy. Political changes could be presented as improvements to existing institutions rather than fundamental restructuring based on philosophical principles. The key was to ensure that each immediate justification was genuinely valid while also serving larger strategic objectives. This required avoiding the temptation to manipulate or deceive the public, which would ultimately undermine the trust necessary for effective leadership. Instead, it meant finding ways to align immediate interests with long-term necessities, creating situations where people would support beneficial policies for their own reasons rather than simply accepting them on authority. The ultimate test of Machiavelli's approach lay in its application to the most fundamental challenge facing any political system: how to maintain the capacity for renewal and adaptation without destroying the stability and continuity that made organized social life possible. This was the central paradox of statecraft: the need to preserve institutions while preventing them from becoming rigid, to maintain traditions while adapting to changing circumstances, and to provide security while avoiding stagnation. The solution required understanding that true political health was dynamic rather than static, based on the capacity for controlled change rather than unchanging stability. Like biological organisms, political systems needed to maintain their essential functions while continuously adapting their methods to changing environments. This meant that the preservation of any particular set of arrangements was less important than the preservation of the underlying capacity for intelligent adaptation. The prince who understood this principle would focus his efforts not on defending existing institutions against all change, but on ensuring that change, when it came, would serve beneficial rather than destructive purposes. He would work to maintain the human qualities, intelligence, courage, integrity, and practical wisdom that made effective governance possible under any institutional arrangement. He would cultivate in his subjects the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that would serve them well regardless of what specific challenges the future might bring. This was perhaps the most demanding aspect of Machiavellian statecraft: the requirement to prepare for an unknowable future while managing the pressing demands of the present. It meant maintaining vigilance without paranoia, planning without rigidity, and acting decisively while remaining open to new information and changing circumstances. Such leadership required not superhuman abilities, but rather the disciplined application of human intelligence to the enduring challenges of political life. The peril that arrived unnoticed was ultimately the peril of forgetting that political achievement, like all human accomplishment, was temporary and conditional. The states and institutions that seemed most permanent were actually the most vulnerable, precisely because their apparent strength led to the relaxation of the vigilance and effort that had made their strength possible. The ruler who remembered this truth and acted upon it would not guarantee his state's survival, but he would give it the best possible chance to adapt and endure through whatever challenges the future might bring. In his final analysis, Machiavelli understood that the art of governance was ultimately the art of maintaining creative tension between opposing forces: stability and change, tradition and innovation, confidence and humility, strength and flexibility. The master politician was one who could hold these contradictions in balance, neither allowing any single element to dominate completely, nor permitting the tension between them to tear the system apart. This was the highest achievement of human political intelligence, and it remained as relevant in his time as it had been in ancient Rome, or would be in whatever future ages might come to read his words.